Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, her hands shaking as two security officers flanked her sides. The salty ocean breeze whipped through her dark hair as she clutched a sealed envelope containing classified documents that could change everything. Behind her, the massive aircraft carrier hummed with activity, but all eyes were now focused on the young intelligence officer who had just blown the whistle on Operation Deep Strike. Admiral Harrison's voice echoed. Across the deck, through the ship's communication system, "Lieutenant Chen, you are hereby relieved of duty and will be escorted off this vessel immediately." The words cut through the air like a blade, and Sarah felt the weight of betrayal from her own command. She had served the Navy for 8 years, climbing through the ranks with dedication and honor, but discovering the truth about the illegal weapons testing had left her with no choice. The helicopter's rotors began spinning, creating a deafening whir that seemed to match the chaos in Sarah's mind. She had uncovered evidence that the Navy was conducting unauthorized nuclear submarine tests in international waters, violating multiple treaties and putting civilian ships at risk. The documents in her possession contained proof of cover-ups, falsified reports, and direct orders from high-ranking officials to hide the program from Congress and allied nations. As the security officers guided her toward the waiting chopper, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her younger brother Mike, who served on a submarine somewhere in these same waters. She wondered if he knew about the dangerous experiments being conducted beneath the waves, or if he was just another pawn in the military's deadly game. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might be saving his life by destroying her own career. Captain Rodriguez, her former commanding officer and mentor, approached with a grim expression. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "These operations are classified for national security reasons. You're making a terrible mistake." But Sarah had seen the footage of the underwater explosions, the radiation readings that exceeded safe limits, and the reports of marine life dying in massive numbers. She knew the difference between protecting her country and protecting a conspiracy. The first security officer, a stern-faced man named Sergeant Williams, checked his watch and motioned for Sarah to move faster. "Ma'am, we need to get you airborne before the weather changes," he said, glancing at the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. Sarah nodded, knowing that her departure would trigger a chain of events that couldn't be undone. She had already sent copies of the classified documents to 3 major news outlets and a congressional oversight committee, ensuring that the truth would come out even if something happened to her. As she climbed into the helicopter, Sarah took one last look at the carrier that had been her home for the past 2 years. The massive ship stretched out like a floating city, with fighter jets lined up on the deck and crew members going about their duties. She thought about the thousands of sailors aboard who trusted their leaders to make the right decisions, and how many of them would be shocked to learn about the secret program running beneath their feet. The pilot, a young man with kind eyes, helped her secure her safety harness. "Where are we headed, Lieutenant?" he asked, though she suspected he already knew the answer. "Naval Station Norfolk," she replied, knowing that her next stop would likely be a military tribunal or worse. The helicopter lifted off the deck, and Sarah watched the Enterprise grow smaller below them, its wake cutting through the blue-gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean. During the flight, Sarah reviewed the events that had led to this moment. 3 months earlier, she had been assigned to analyze sonar readings from routine submarine patrols. What she found instead were signatures from underwater explosions that didn't match any known weapons testing schedules. When she asked her supervisor about the anomalies, she was told to classify the data and forget about it. But Sarah couldn't forget, and her investigation had uncovered a web of lies that reached the highest levels of naval command. The helicopter flew through patches of turbulence, and Sarah gripped her seat as they bounced through the rough air. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface hiding secrets that the public would never know. She thought about the environmental impact reports she had read, documenting how the illegal testing was destroying underwater ecosystems and contaminating fishing grounds used by local communities. The Navy's own scientists had warned about the long-term consequences, but their concerns were dismissed by officials more interested in maintaining their black budget programs. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Sarah noticed the pilot speaking urgently into his radio. His face had grown pale, and he kept glancing at his instruments with increasing concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, but he held up a hand, still listening to the voice crackling through his headset. The two security officers had also noticed the change in atmosphere, and they exchanged worried looks while checking their own communication devices. The pilot finally turned to face his passengers, his expression grave. "We're receiving reports of unusual seismic activity in the waters below," he announced. "Command is ordering all aircraft to maintain current altitude and report any visual anomalies." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the helicopter's air conditioning. She knew that the timing of her escort and this mysterious underwater disturbance couldn't be a coincidence. Through the helicopter's window, she could see the ocean surface beginning to change. What had been calm blue waters were now showing signs of agitation, with foam and bubbles rising from the depths. The pilot's radio crackled with increasingly frantic messages from other aircraft and naval vessels in the area, all reporting the same phenomenon. Sarah realized that her worst fears about Operation Deep Strike might be coming true, and that her exposure of the program might have arrived too late to prevent a catastrophic accident. The documents in her possession suddenly felt heavier than ever, carrying the weight of both evidence and responsibility for what was about to unfold beneath the waves. The helicopter shuddered violently as a massive shockwave rippled through the water below. Sarah pressed her face against the window, watching in horror as the ocean surface erupted in a column of white foam and spray that reached nearly to their altitude. The pilot fought to maintain control as the aircraft was buffeted by the pressure wave, his knuckles white on the controls as alarms began sounding throughout the cockpit. What the hell was that? Sergeant Williams shouted over the noise, his professional composure cracking for the first time since they had left the carrier. The second security officer, a younger man named Corporal Hayes, was frantically trying to reach command on his radio, but all they could hear was static, mixed with panicked voices from other units in the area. Sarah's worst fears were being realized as she witnessed firsthand the consequences of the illegal testing program she had tried to expose. The pilot's voice was steady despite the chaos around them. "Command, this is Hawk 7. We have a major underwater disturbance at coordinates 3742 north, 6815 west. Recommend immediate evacuation of all surface vessels in the area." But his transmission was met with silence, suggesting that whatever was happening below was affecting communications across the entire fleet. Sarah thought about the classified documents in her possession and wondered if they contained information that could help explain this disaster. As the foam and spray began to settle, Sarah noticed something dark rising from the depths. At first it appeared to be debris from the explosion, but as it grew larger and more defined, she realized with growing dread that it was something much more significant. The water around the object was still churning violently, creating whirlpools and eddies that would be dangerous for any surface vessel caught in the area. The helicopter's engines strained as the pilot tried to gain altitude, following standard protocols for aerial observation of underwater incidents. Sarah could see other aircraft in the distance, military helicopters and reconnaissance planes that had been scrambled to investigate the disturbance, but none of them seemed prepared for what was emerging from the ocean depths, and their formation began to scatter as pilots realized the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "Corporal," Hayes finally managed to establish contact with a Coast Guard cutter operating about 20 miles to the east. "Coast Guard vessel Thunder Bay, this is Marine Unit 7. We have a major incident requiring immediate response," he reported, his voice tight with tension. The response came back quickly, indicating that the Coast Guard had already detected the disturbance on their sonar and was en route to provide assistance. But Sarah knew that conventional rescue vessels would be inadequate for whatever was happening below the surface. The dark object continued to rise, and Sarah realized with a mixture of fascination and terror that it was man-made. The smooth metallic surface reflected the late afternoon sunlight as it broke through the waves, and she could make out the distinctive shape of a submarine's hull. But this wasn't any ordinary submarine. It was massive, easily twice the size of the largest vessel she had studied during her intelligence training. The classification markings visible on its side were unlike anything in the current U.S. Navy inventory. "That's not one of ours," the pilot muttered, unconsciously voicing what everyone in the helicopter was thinking. Sarah's mind raced as she considered the implications. The documents she carried contained references to experimental submarine designs and prototype vessels that officially didn't exist. She had assumed they were theoretical projects or early-stage developments. But the evidence rising from the ocean suggested that these programs were much more advanced than anyone had realized. The submarine's conning tower emerged fully from the water, followed by what appeared to be unusual antenna arrays and sensor equipment that Sarah didn't recognize. Steam and spray continued to pour from vents along its hull, suggesting that its emergency surfacing had been violent and uncontrolled. The vessel listed slightly to one side, and Sarah could see what looked like damage to its outer hull plating. Whatever had forced it to surface had been powerful enough to affect even this massive craft. Sergeant Williams was speaking rapidly into his own communication device, trying to contact the Enterprise and report their observations. Enterprise Control. This is Security Team Alpha. We have visual confirmation of an unidentified submarine, approximately 400 feet in length, emergency surfaced at our current location. Vessel appears to be in distress and of unknown origin. The response that came back was garbled, but Sarah caught fragments suggesting that the carrier was already scrambling additional aircraft and preparing for a potential rescue operation. As they circled the area at a safe distance, Sarah noticed movement on the submarine's deck. Small figures appeared near the conning tower, and she realized that crew members were emerging from the vessel. Even from their altitude, she could see that they were wearing unusual protective suits rather than standard naval uniforms. This detail sent another chill through her as she considered what kind of hazardous materials or experimental technology might be aboard the mysterious craft. The pilot received new orders through his headset and began adjusting their flight path. We're being directed to maintain observation and relay position updates to incoming rescue vessels, he announced. Command wants continuous surveillance until a full response team arrives on scene. Sarah understood the strategic importance of monitoring the situation, but she also felt increasingly uneasy about their role as witnesses to what might be a classified incident of unprecedented magnitude. The ocean around the submarine was beginning to show signs of contamination. Sarah could see an oily sheen spreading outward from the vessel's location, and the water itself seemed to have taken on an unusual greenish tint. She remembered reading about experimental nuclear propulsion systems in the classified files, and wondered if the submarine's emergency surfacing had resulted in a radioactive leak that would threaten marine life for hundreds of miles around. More aircraft were arriving on scene, including what appeared to be specialized hazmat and radiation monitoring teams based on their distinctive equipment configurations. Sarah watched as they established a perimeter around the submarine, keeping their distance while deploying sensors to assess the situation. The level of coordination suggested that this type of incident had been planned for, which meant that the Navy knew their experimental submarines posed significant risks to both their crews and the environment. The wind began to pick up, and the helicopter pilot adjusted their position to compensate for the changing conditions. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Sarah realized that weather would soon become a factor in any rescue operation. The combination of a damaged submarine, potential radiation hazard, and incoming storm created a scenario that would challenge even the most experienced emergency response teams. She clutched the classified documents closer, knowing that they might contain crucial information about the submarine's capabilities and vulnerabilities that could save lives in the hours ahead. The submarine's emergency beacon began transmitting, filling the airwaves with a distinctive pattern that Sarah recognized from her intelligence training. But this wasn't a standard distress signal. The frequency and encoding were unlike anything in the current naval communication protocols. As she listened to the rhythmic pulses through the helicopter's radio system, she realized that the submarine was broadcasting on channels reserved for the most classified military operations. Through her window, Sarah could see that the crew members on the submarine's deck were working frantically to deploy what appeared to be emergency equipment. Their protective suits reflected the afternoon sunlight with an unusual metallic sheen, and she noticed that they moved with the careful precision of personnel trained to handle hazardous materials. The sight confirmed her growing suspicion that this vessel was involved in experimental technology far beyond conventional submarine operations. The pilot received another urgent transmission and immediately began banking the helicopter toward a new heading. "We're being ordered to establish a wider perimeter," he announced, his voice tense with concern. "Radiation detection teams are reporting elevated readings in the area." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her worst fears about the illegal testing program were coming true. The classified documents in her possession contained warnings from Navy scientists about the risks of experimental nuclear propulsion systems, and it appeared that those warnings had been ignored with catastrophic results. Corporal Hayes was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to piece together information from the various response teams converging on the scene. Coast Guard is reporting unusual marine life behavior in a 15-mile radius, he reported, his face pale as he relayed the disturbing news. Dolphins and whales are fleeing the area at high speed, and there are reports of dead fish floating to the surface. Sarah remembered reading about similar incidents in the classified files, experiments that had resulted in environmental damage that was subsequently covered up by military authorities. The mysterious submarine continued to list as more steam vented from its hull. Sarah could see through her binoculars that the crew members on deck were now attempting to access what looked like emergency hatches along the vessel's side. Their movement suggested urgency, possibly indicating that conditions inside the submarine were deteriorating rapidly. She wondered how many people were trapped inside the massive craft and whether conventional rescue equipment would be adequate to evacuate them safely. A new group of aircraft appeared on the horizon, flying in formation toward their location. Unlike the military helicopters and reconnaissance planes already on scene, these appeared to be specialized vessels with unusual configurations. Sarah noticed that they maintained a much higher altitude and seemed to be equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment rather than rescue gear. Their presence suggested that this incident was being treated as more than just a submarine accident. Sergeant Williams was speaking quietly into his secure communication device, and Sarah caught fragments of his conversation that made her blood run cold. Containment protocols. Authorized personnel only. Civilian exposure minimized. The words confirmed her suspicion that the military was more concerned with covering up the incident than with addressing its environmental and safety implications. She thought about the news outlets that should already be receiving the classified documents she had transmitted, and hoped that public pressure would force a transparent response to this disaster. The ocean around the submarine was now clearly contaminated. The oily sheen had spread to cover several square miles, and the unusual green coloration of the water was becoming more pronounced. Sarah could see that marine animals were avoiding the area entirely, creating an eerie dead zone around the stricken vessel. She remembered reading about experimental fuel systems that used exotic radioactive materials, compounds that were far more dangerous than conventional nuclear reactor fuel. The helicopter's radiation detection equipment began registering elevated readings, prompting the pilot to increase their altitude and distance from the submarine. "We're picking up gamma radiation at levels approaching the safety threshold," he announced, his voice reflecting growing concern about their exposure. "Command is ordering all non-essential aircraft to maintain a minimum 5-mile standoff distance." Sarah realized that the crew members still working on the submarine's deck were facing radiation exposure that could prove fatal within hours. New developments on the submarine caught everyone's attention, as what appeared to be a secondary explosion occurred. Deep within the vessel's hull, steam and smoke began pouring from additional vents, and the craft settled lower in the water as if taking on flooding. The crew members on deck abandoned their equipment and moved toward what Sarah assumed was the primary escape hatch near the conning tower. Their urgent movement suggested that the situation inside the submarine had become critical. The specialized aircraft that had arrived began deploying equipment into the water around the submarine. Sarah could see that they were releasing what looked like containment barriers, possibly designed to limit the spread of radioactive contamination. The coordinated nature of their response indicated that protocols for this type of incident had been developed in advance, which meant that the Navy had known about the risks associated with their experimental submarine program, but had chosen to proceed anyway. Through her binoculars, Sarah watched as the first rescue helicopter attempted to approach the submarine's deck. The aircraft maintained a cautious distance while lowering a rescue basket, but the pilot was clearly struggling with the turbulent air currents created by the heat and steam rising from the damaged vessel. The radiation levels were apparently too high for a safe approach, forcing the rescue team to abort their first attempt and circle back for another try. The storm clouds were moving closer, and Sarah could see lightning flickering in the distance. The combination of high radiation levels, contaminated water, and incoming severe weather was creating a nightmare scenario for rescue operations. She realized that the crew members trapped on the submarine might face an impossible choice between radiation exposure on deck and potentially fatal conditions inside the flooded vessel. The classified documents she carried contained technical specifications that might help rescue teams understand the submarine's layout and emergency systems. But she was currently powerless to share that crucial information. More surface vessels were appearing on the horizon, including what appeared to be specialized nuclear incident response ships. Their arrival confirmed that this was far more than a routine submarine accident. It was a radiological emergency that could affect shipping lanes and coastal areas for hundreds of miles around. Sarah thought about the fishing communities and commercial vessels that regularly operated in these waters, and wondered how many people might already have been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation without knowing it. The submarine's emergency beacon changed its transmission pattern, now broadcasting what Sarah recognized as an automated distress signal, indicating imminent hull breach. The vessel was sinking slowly but steadily, and the crew members on deck were running out of time for a safe evacuation. As she watched the desperate scene unfolding below, Sarah realized that her decision to expose the illegal testing program might have come too late to prevent this catastrophe, but it might still be crucial for ensuring that the truth about the incident couldn't be buried, along with the evidence disappearing beneath the waves. A massive explosion rocked the submarine's hull, sending a shockwave through the water that reached their helicopter even at their increased altitude. Sarah watched in horror as a section of the vessel's outer plating was blown clear, revealing the complex internal structure of what was clearly no ordinary military submarine. The blast illuminated strange geometric patterns and crystalline formations within the hull that seemed to pulse with an eerie blue-green light. The crew members on deck were thrown to the metal surface by the force of the explosion, and Sarah could see that several were no longer moving. Those who remained conscious were crawling toward emergency equipment lockers, their protective suits apparently damaged by flying debris. The radiation readings on the helicopter's instruments spiked dramatically, forcing the pilot to climb to an even higher altitude while still maintaining visual contact with the disaster below. "Jesus Christ," Sergeant Williams muttered, his professional composure finally cracking as he witnessed the full scope of the catastrophe. What kind of reactor design creates explosions like that? Sarah knew from the classified documents that the submarine was powered by an experimental fusion system that used elements not found in nature, compounds that had been synthesized in secret government laboratories. The failure of such a system could release energy equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. The mysterious blue-green light emanating from the submarine's damaged hull was becoming brighter and more intense. Sarah had read theoretical papers about exotic matter propulsion systems in the classified files, technologies that were supposed to be decades away from practical application. But the evidence before her eyes suggested that these experimental systems were not only real, but catastrophically unstable when damaged. The light pulsed in regular intervals, creating an almost hypnotic pattern that seemed to affect the behavior of nearby aircraft. Corporal Hayes was monitoring emergency frequencies when he suddenly went rigid, his face draining of color as he listened to an incoming transmission. "Command is reporting similar incidents at 3 other locations in the Atlantic," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Unknown submarines surfacing simultaneously, all showing signs of severe damage." Sarah felt the pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place as she realized that Operation Deep Strike involved multiple experimental vessels, and they were all failing at the same time. The rescue helicopter that had been attempting to evacuate crew members from the submarine's deck suddenly veered away, its pilot apparently receiving urgent orders to abort the mission. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see that the aircraft's instruments were malfunctioning, with sparks visible from damaged electronic equipment. The electromagnetic effects generated by the submarine's failing propulsion system were apparently interfering with conventional aviation electronics, making close approach impossible for normal rescue aircraft. New vessels were approaching the scene, but these were unlike anything Sarah had seen in her 8 years of naval service. They moved through the water without visible propulsion systems, leaving no wake as they glided silently toward the stricken submarine. Their hulls reflected light in the same unusual way as the submarine's damaged sections, suggesting they were constructed from similar exotic materials. Sarah realized that these were not conventional rescue vessels, but rather specialized craft, designed specifically for incidents involving experimental technology. The storm was moving closer, bringing with it not just wind and rain, but unusual atmospheric effects that seemed related to the submarine's condition. Lightning was striking the water around the vessel with unnatural frequency, and the bolts themselves appeared to have an unusual blue-white coloration, rather than the typical yellow-white of normal electrical discharge. Sarah remembered reading about electromagnetic anomalies associated with exotic matter experiments, effects that could influence weather patterns and atmospheric electricity. The submarine's hull was now visibly warping, as if the metal itself was being affected by forces beyond normal physics. Sections of the outer plating were beginning to phase in and out of visibility, creating a disturbing optical effect that made Sarah question her own eyesight. The classified documents had mentioned theoretical research into dimensional manipulation technology, concepts that she had dismissed as science fiction until this moment. The reality of what she was witnessing suggested that the military's experimental programs had ventured into areas of science that were barely understood by mainstream researchers. One of the mysterious rescue vessels made contact with the submarine, and Sarah watched as crew members were transferred using what appeared to be some form of energy-based transportation system rather than conventional rescue equipment. The personnel simply materialized aboard the rescue craft without any visible means of transit, suggesting technology that violated known laws of physics. She realized that the secrets contained in her classified documents were only the tip of an iceberg involving discoveries that could fundamentally change human understanding of reality itself. The pilot received new orders that caused him to bank sharply away from the scene. "We're being directed to a secure facility for immediate debriefing," he announced, his voice reflecting confusion about the rapidly changing situation. "All witnesses to this incident are being classified as essential personnel requiring protective custody." Sarah understood that the military was implementing containment protocols designed to prevent information about the exotic technology from reaching the public, protocols that would effectively make them prisoners until the situation could be controlled. As they flew away from the disaster site, Sarah looked back to see that the submarine was beginning to sink beneath the waves. The blue-green light continued to pulse from its damaged hull, creating an underwater glow that was visible even as the vessel disappeared from sight. The contaminated water around the site was taking on an increasingly unnatural appearance, with patterns of light that suggested ongoing reactions involving the exotic materials used in the submarine's construction. The specialized rescue vessels were deploying what appeared to be containment fields around the sinking submarine, energy barriers that created visible distortions in the air above the water. Sarah realized that these were not merely environmental protection measures, but rather attempts to prevent the exotic technology from interacting with normal matter in ways that could have global consequences. The classified documents had mentioned theoretical scenarios involving runaway reactions that could affect the fundamental structure of matter itself. Radio chatter from other aircraft indicated that the three similar incidents occurring elsewhere in the Atlantic were showing the same progression of effects. Experimental submarines with exotic propulsion systems were failing simultaneously, creating multiple contamination zones that posed unprecedented challenges for containment efforts. Sarah began to understand that Operation Deep Strike was not just an illegal weapons testing program, but rather a massive experiment involving technologies that could threaten the stability of the planet itself. The helicopter was now flying toward what appeared to be a floating facility that had not been there when they departed from the Enterprise. The structure seemed to materialize from the ocean itself, rising from beneath the waves with the same unusual properties as the rescue vessels. Sarah realized that the military possessed technology far beyond anything acknowledged in public, capabilities that could explain decades of unexplained phenomena and government secrecy. Her decision to expose the illegal testing program had inadvertently revealed the existence of a shadow civilization, operating with scientific principles that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about the universe. As they approached the mysterious facility, Sarah clutched the classified documents tighter, knowing that they contained evidence of crimes against not just national law, but potentially against the laws of physics themselves. The knowledge that she possessed could either help prevent future catastrophes or ensure that she never saw freedom again, depending on how the powerful forces behind these experiments chose to respond to her whistleblowing efforts. The floating facility grew larger as they approached, revealing architecture that defied conventional engineering principles. The structure appeared to be constructed from the same exotic materials as the submarine, with surfaces that seemed to bend light around them and create impossible geometric patterns. Sarah realized that this was not a hastily assembled emergency response platform, but rather a permanent installation that had been hidden beneath the ocean's surface, probably for years or even decades. Landing on the facility's deck felt like stepping into another world. The surface beneath their feet was solid, yet somehow seemed to pulse with energy, and Sarah noticed that her compass was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north in the presence of whatever forces powered this place. Personnel wearing the same unusual protective suits as the submarine crew moved with practiced efficiency, suggesting that incidents like the one they had just witnessed were not unprecedented events, but rather unfortunate but expected consequences of ongoing experimental operations. A tall woman with graying hair and the bearing of a senior military officer approached their group as they disembarked from the helicopter. "Lieutenant Chen," she said, her voice carrying authority that transcended normal military rank structures. "I am Director Morgan of the Anomalous Technology Research Division. We need to discuss the documents you've been carrying." Sarah felt a chill as she realized that this woman knew about her whistleblowing activities, which meant that the organization behind these experiments had been monitoring her investigation from the beginning. The facility's interior was even more extraordinary than its exterior. Corridors seemed to extend farther than the building's external dimensions should have allowed, and the walls displayed information screens showing data that Sarah couldn't begin to interpret. Mathematical equations involving variables she had never encountered scrolled past alongside three-dimensional models of atomic structures that violated everything she had learned about chemistry and physics. She began to understand that the scientific principles governing this place operated according to rules that mainstream academia had never discovered. Director Morgan led them through a series of security checkpoints that scanned not just for weapons and contraband, but apparently for biological and quantum signatures that Sarah couldn't identify. "The submarine you witnessed was the USS Prometheus, one of 4 vessels in our dimensional propulsion testing program," Morgan explained as they walked. "The simultaneous failures you've learned about represent a cascade reaction that we've been working to prevent for the past 15 years. Sarah realized that the illegal testing program she had uncovered was just the public face of research into technologies that could fundamentally alter reality itself. They entered a briefing room where holographic displays showed the current status of the 3 other submarine incidents occurring across the Atlantic. Each site showed the same pattern of exotic energy emissions and dimensional distortions, confirming that the failures were not isolated accidents, but rather symptoms of a larger instability in the experimental technology. "The exotic matter used in our propulsion systems exists in a delicate quantum equilibrium," Morgan continued. "When one system fails, it can trigger sympathetic resonances in similar systems across vast distances." Sarah's mind reeled as she absorbed the implications of what she was learning. The classified documents she had stolen contained only the most basic information about projects that involved manipulation of space-time itself. The submarine accidents were not environmental disasters, but rather breaches in the fabric of reality that could potentially spread beyond containment. She began to understand why such extreme secrecy surrounded these programs. Public knowledge of their existence could cause panic on a global scale. Sergeant Williams and Corporal Hayes were escorted to separate briefing areas, leaving Sarah alone with Director Morgan and a team of scientists whose credentials, according to their identification badges, included degrees from universities that Sarah had never heard of. "Your investigation has forced us to accelerate certain containment protocols," Morgan explained. "The media outlets and congressional contacts you've reached will receive modified versions of your evidence, documentation that reveals enough truth to satisfy their questions while protecting information that could destabilize civilization." The holographic displays began showing footage from the submarine's final moments before the accident. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the vessel's experimental drive created what appeared to be a temporary gateway to somewhere else, a rent in space through which she could see glimpses of an environment that was definitely not part of Earth's ocean. Strange shapes moved beyond the portal, and she realized that the submarine's Crew had not just been testing propulsion, technology, but rather exploring pathways to other dimensions or parallel realities. The Prometheus was conducting routine dimensional reconnaissance when it encountered what we call a reality storm, a disturbance in the quantum substrate that can destabilize exotic matter containment systems. One of the scientists explained. Sarah learned that the crew members she had seen on the submarine's deck were not wearing radiation protection suits, but rather dimensional isolation gear designed to prevent their consciousness from being scattered across multiple realities during a containment breach. The true dangers they faced were far more exotic than simple nuclear contamination. Director Morgan activated additional displays showing the global scope of the Anomalous Technology Research Division's operations. Secret facilities existed beneath major cities, hidden within mountain ranges and floating in ocean depths around the world. Each installation was researching different aspects of technologies that mainstream science considered impossible, from faster-than-light communication to temporal manipulation systems. Sarah realized that she had stumbled onto evidence of a parallel civilization that had been developing alongside normal human society for generations. Your brother Michael serves aboard the USS Temporal, one of our most advanced research vessels, Morgan revealed, causing Sarah's heart to skip a beat. He volunteered for the Dimensional Reconnaissance program 3 years ago and has been involved in mapping alternate timeline branches, where human history developed differently. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror as she learned that her brother was alive, but also that he was involved in operations that could potentially alter the course of human existence itself. The containment efforts around the 4 submarine accident sites were showing signs of success, with the exotic energy emissions gradually stabilizing as specialized equipment neutralized the dimensional breaches. However, the cost of these failures was becoming apparent as reports arrived of permanent alterations to local physics in the affected areas. Regions of ocean where gravity operated differently, zones where time moved at altered rates, and pockets of space where matter existed in quantum superposition states that could persist indefinitely. Sarah was offered a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could accept a position within the Anomalous Technology Research Division, using her intelligence skills to help monitor and contain the consequences of exotic technology research while living in a world where the impossible was routine. Alternatively, she could undergo a memory modification procedure that would erase her knowledge of these events while allowing her to return to normal military service, with her whistleblowing activities explained as a misunderstanding about conventional weapons testing. The documents you've been carrying represent only a tiny fraction of the knowledge we've accumulated, Morgan explained. True reality is far stranger and more dangerous than anything you could have imagined when you began your investigation. The choice you make now will determine whether you become part of the solution to managing these forces or whether you return to the illusion of a world where physics operates according to textbook principles. Sarah realized that her attempt to expose government secrets had led her to discover truths that challenged the very nature of existence itself. As she considered her options, Sarah looked out through the facility's windows at the ocean surface where the USS Prometheus had disappeared. The water appeared normal now, but she knew that beneath the waves lay evidence of technologies that could reshape reality according to human will. Her decision would not only affect her own future but potentially influence humanity's relationship with forces that could either elevate the species to godlike capabilities or destroy everything that had ever existed. The weight of that responsibility was far heavier than the classified documents she had carried, and far more consequential than any military tribunal she might have faced for her whistleblowing activities. Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights in the facility's guest quarters, wrestling with a decision that would reshape not just her understanding of reality, but her entire existence. The room itself seemed to respond to her emotional state, with walls that shifted color based on her stress levels and furniture that adjusted itself to provide optimal comfort. She realized that even the most basic amenities in this place utilized technology that mainstream science would consider impossible, making her previous life feel like a primitive existence by comparison. On the 4th morning, Director Morgan presented Sarah with additional information that made her choice even more complex. The facility's computers had completed analysis of the 4 submarine incidents, revealing that the dimensional breaches had created permanent alterations to the laws of physics in the affected areas. Ships passing through these zones were reporting navigation equipment malfunctions, unusual time dilation effects, and encounters with phenomena that suggested overlap between parallel realities. The accidents had essentially created windows into alternate versions of Earth where history had unfolded differently. One of the breach zones is showing signs of inhabited parallel Earth contact. Morgan explained as holographic displays showed sonar readings of structures that appeared to be artificial, but followed architectural principles unknown to human civilization. We're detecting communication attempts from intelligences that appear to be alternate versions of humanity, versions that develop different technological paths and may have solutions to problems we're still struggling to solve. Sarah realized that her investigation had inadvertently opened doorways that could lead to contact with civilizations that were simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The memory modification procedure that Morgan had offered as an alternative to joining the program was revealed to be far more complex than simple amnesia. We've developed techniques that can edit specific memories while preserving overall personality and experience, one of the facility's neuroscientists explained. You could return to your normal life with implanted memories of a successful whistleblowing investigation that exposed conventional weapons testing violations, complete with congressional hearings and policy reforms that would satisfy your sense of justice and duty. The artificial memories would be indistinguishable from real experiences, allowing Sarah to live a fulfilling life while protecting the secrets she had discovered. But Sarah's decision was complicated by new revelations about her family's connection to the program. Her brother Michael appeared on a secure communication channel, speaking from the bridge of a submarine that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, but you need to understand that our family has been involved with anomalous technology research for 3 generations, he explained. Dad's work as a Navy engineer wasn't focused on conventional propulsion systems. He was part of the team that developed the first stable exotic matter containment protocols. Sarah learned that her decision to investigate the illegal testing program had been guided by inherited knowledge that she hadn't consciously recognized. The true scope of human technological development was laid out before her in a series of briefings that challenged everything she thought she knew about history and science. Ancient civilizations had possessed technologies that modern mainstream science was only beginning to rediscover, and secret government programs had been working for centuries to reconstruct and improve upon these capabilities. The submarine accidents were just the latest in a series of setbacks that occurred whenever humanity pushed too far into territories that required wisdom to match technological capability. That public version of human civilization is essentially a protective facade, Morgan revealed. We maintain the illusion of conventional physics and limited technology to prevent social breakdown while we work to solve problems that could threaten the survival of our species. Sarah learned about research programs investigating threats from parallel dimensions, timeline manipulation attempts by hostile forces, and the gradual degradation of reality's stability caused by excessive exotic technology use. Her role as an intelligence officer had prepared her to analyze complex threats, but nothing had prepared her for dangers that operated according to principles beyond normal human comprehension. The decision process was interrupted by an emergency alert indicating that one of the dimensional breach zones was expanding beyond containment projections. The USS Prometheus site was generating spatial distortions that were affecting shipping lanes hundreds of miles away, and reports were coming in of vessels discovering themselves in waters that matched no known geographical locations. Sarah realized that the consequences of the submarine accidents were not stabilizing, as hoped, but rather growing into a crisis that could expose the existence of exotic technology to the entire world. Director Morgan offered Sarah a chance to participate in the emergency response mission, giving her first-hand experience with the technologies and responsibilities that would define her life if she chose to join the program. They traveled to the breach site aboard a vessel that moved through space by manipulating the quantum substrate, rather than conventional propulsion, arriving at coordinates where the ocean itself had taken on properties that violated basic physics. Water flowed upward in spirals that disappeared into rifts in space, and the horizon showed glimpses of alternate Earths where different versions of human civilization had developed, working alongside teams of specialists who treated impossible phenomena as routine engineering challenges. Sarah helped deploy containment equipment that stabilized the expanding breach through careful manipulation of exotic matter fields. She witnessed firsthand the dedication and expertise required to manage technologies that could reshape reality, and began to understand why such extreme secrecy was necessary to protect both the research and the general population. The work was simultaneously the most fascinating and terrifying experience of her life. The successful containment of the breach site provided Sarah with the final piece of information she needed to make her decision. As the dimensional rifts closed and normal physics reasserted itself over the affected area, she realized that she had found her true calling. The whistleblowing investigation that had seemed so important just days earlier now felt like preparation for responsibilities that dwarfed conventional military service. She was being offered the chance to help protect humanity from threats that most people could never imagine, and to work with technologies that could eventually lead to a better future for the entire species. Sarah's final conversation with Director Morgan took place overlooking the ocean, where the USS Prometheus had disappeared. The choice you make defines not just your future, but potentially the future of human civilization, Morgan explained. We need people with your combination of moral courage and analytical skills to help guide our research in directions that enhance rather than threaten human existence. Sarah understood that accepting the position would mean leaving behind her old life entirely, but it would also mean contributing to discoveries that could elevate humanity to capabilities that were currently beyond imagination. She handed over the classified documents that had started her journey, knowing that they would be filed alongside thousands of other reports documenting humanity's gradual mastery of forces that operated beyond conventional understanding. I accept, she said simply, realizing that her investigation into illegal weapons testing had led her to discover her true purpose. The ocean stretched out before them, hiding secrets that would take lifetimes to fully explore. And Sarah knew that she was ready to spend those lifetimes pushing the boundaries of what was possible while working to ensure that humanity's growing power was matched by the wisdom necessary to use it responsibly. The facility around them hummed with activity as teams of researchers continued their work to understand and harness technologies that could reshape the very fabric of reality. Sarah took one last look at the normal world she was leaving behind, then turned toward a future where the impossible was just another day at the office, and where her skills as an intelligence officer would be applied to mysteries that stretched across dimensions and timelines. Her journey as a whistleblower had ended, but her adventure as a guardian of humanity's most extraordinary secrets was just beginning.